Welcome back to the Astrocast. I'm your host, Rue. Today is May 6th, 2024, and new moon is finally upon us. I hope you're out enjoying it. I hope you get some clear weather. We have not had much clear weather here in Charlotte. Unfortunately, it's been pretty much cloudy all week. This has been a pretty regular happening over the last few months, it seems. So last month during new moon, we had good weather, but I think for the prior 4 months, we have been rained out for around 4 or 5 days, due to new moon, or not due to new moon, but around new moon. And man, I don't know. It gets me down every time. And I really have my fingers crossed because here, let me check. In 34 days, I will be making my annual dark sky trip with my buddy Chris, and we are heading out to Bortle 1 skies to see what we can come up with. I've got both of the rigs ready to go. I've got a little bit of final testing to do before we go, and I was really hoping that new moon would be great this time of the month so I could do that testing. I mean, I can do the testing anytime, really. When you're testing out, a new telescope or a new camera or any kind of new gear for that matter, ideal conditions are great, but they're not really necessary. You just mainly want to make sure that your stars are all sharp, that the guiding is working correctly. If you're testing a filter, obviously you want to make sure that it is filtering properly, which is something that I did a couple weeks ago when I tested out my new Extreme F2 filter, which is doing a very, very good job, I might add. I've actually had the chance to do 2 images with it now. I did the Satyr region, and that was just, believe it or not, that was only 25 minutes of integration. And I'm going to post the image that I got in just 25 minutes with that filter. And keep in mind, I was using my Rokinon 135 f2 lens, which is kind of my favorite new rig right now. I mean, it's my second rig. I also have a Skyguider Pro that I can use for wide field stuff like Milky Way shots and what have you. But the Rokinon has really been performing well above its price. I've been kind of shocked at how great that lens is once you get it set up properly. And a couple episodes back on the creating the ultimate wide field rig episode, I discussed in very great detail exactly what it takes to get that lens to perform how you really want it to when you're out in the field doing astronomy. And I got to say that I'm quite happy. It took, a good year to get it to where it needed to be. And I'm not exaggerating. It literally took me a year. I was looking through my memories on Facebook just this week, and I had a photo of the rig. And I was laughing to myself thinking, boy, oh boy, if only I knew the road ahead of me to get that thing kitted out just right. Now, that's not to say it would take you a year to build your version of this rig. For me, it was more or less that I couldn't afford to buy everything all at once, and then I solved each problem as it came up. So that's a good thing about astronomy. And I think a lot of times newcomers to the hobby, they unfortunately, when they are first getting started, they'll go and they'll build their rig, which isn't terribly difficult to do, plugging in all your cables, etc. Not to say that you can't mess that up, because you can certainly mess up setting up a rig if you're not careful. But after they do get everything plugged in correctly, they'll, go out, hopefully in their driveway if they can. But God forbid they drive all the way out to a dark site somewhere far away from their home and just try to get it to work the first night. And it can be really frustrating. And what they'll do, and I say this from experience because this is what I did, is you'll try to solve one problem, and then when you can't figure it out, you'll just move on to the next problem. And when you can't figure that out, you move on to the next problem, and you rinse and repeat until you're frustrated and cold and it's 3:00 in the morning, and then you just go home and give up. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is far too many people in our hobby have this exact same scenario happen 2 or 3 times, and then they just give up entirely. And that's how we see so many, used rigs for sale. I'm looking at you, Celestron AVX with an 8-inch SCT telescope attached to it. Beginners have no business purchasing something like that. Now, when I first got into astronomy, I thought to myself, the bigger the better. You know, I want to go out and buy the biggest telescope that I can afford. And I couldn't afford anything like a what's it called? Edge HD telescope, SCT. But I thought to myself, like, that's what, you know, I would get if I could afford it. That's ultimately what I would want. And here I am, you know, 3-4 years later. And the truth is, I don't know if I have any interest in getting that type of scope yet. I love the long focal length that it can provide, but I feel like most people these days, when they buy that type of telescope, they often do it for the possibility of getting a hyperstar. And so let's back up for just a moment. So the telescope that I am referring to is made by a company called Celestron. They're extremely popular. They've been around for a long time. They make a lot of great astronomy gear. So they make in particular a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, or SCT for short, that is it's been around for decades. The C8, C10, C12, it's actually 9.25 and C11, I believe. They come in different sizes, but generally speaking, they're pretty large telescopes and they have very long focal lengths. And what that means is you're able to essentially zoom in on things much further in the sky than you would with something like a smallish refractor, where you would be more zoomed out, but get a much wider field of view. And a lot of people like to use these type of scopes because they want to image, you know, smaller galaxies or smaller nebula, perhaps the Caldwell catalog, which has a lot of smaller objects in it, and things of that nature. But the problem that happens is a lot of newcomers to astronomy, they see this Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope and they think that's the ultimate telescope. Obviously, that's the one that I should buy. They go out and purchase it, and then exactly what I just described a few minutes ago happens. They can't figure out how to work it. They can't get it balanced properly. The AVX is not the most user-friendly equatorial mount to start with, and they end up on the used market getting sold, and that happens all the time. Now, the flip side to that is people who are experienced in astronomy and astrophotography. They maybe start with a refractor, which is what I would suggest anybody who is new to this hobby start with. A refractor is kind of your classic type of telescope, if you will, you know, lens in the front, lens in the back, sometimes lenses in between if you have a triplet, or even more lenses in the refractor. And then, you know, once they feel like they've mastered that, they might move up to a larger telescope like an SCT, which would be a Celestron Edge HD 9.25, for example. And then there is a really cool accessory that you can purchase called a Hyperstar. And the Hyperstar essentially is an add-on lens that is a reducer. And when I say reducer, what I mean is that it reduces the focal length of the telescope, but in doing so, it speeds up the telescope. So one of the things about Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes is they're not very fast telescopes. And when I say fast, I mean they don't gather light as quickly as something like the Rokinon 135 that I was describing earlier. And the downside to that is that, you know, depending on what you're imaging and what have you, you might have to spend a lot more time imaging the target that you want to get. For example, my Rokinon 135 is an f2 lens, okay? And I have a refractor that is an 80 millimeter refractor with a focal length of 448 millimeters. That's with the reducer installed. And that is f5.6. So my Rokinon actually gathers light 6 to 7 times faster than that refractor. So what that means is for every 1 minute that I capture with that Rokinon, it would take 7 minutes to capture the equivalent data with the refractor telescope. Now, that's not to say that an f2 lens is going to be perfect for all circumstances. It's not. You actually want to have higher f-stops for certain situations. And one of those situations is, in fact, when you are shooting at a very long focal length. So this is very advantageous for many reasons, not the least of which is optical distortion, because the faster your lens is, the less error you can make in terms of your optical train. And if anything is, out of whack, or if there's any tilt or anything like that, at f2, it's going to show up a whole lot more than it would at f10. And chromatic aberration is also affected greatly. So this is like false colors. You could get color fringing and those sorts of things. You're not going to see that as much at f10. So there is a reason why people want to have an f10 lens with telescope with a super long focal length. And that's because they are ideally suited for shooting things like small galaxies or planetary nebulae and these types of things. Now, the other big advantage to a telescope like this is that they sell an accessory, like I mentioned earlier, called a Hyperstar. And what this does is it actually attaches to the front of the Schmidt-Cassegrain scope, and it acts as a reducer. So it reduces the focal length from, I believe it's 1200 millimeters. Let me check and see what a C8's focal length is. Boy, I was way off. 2032 millimeters is what an 8-inch Edge HD telescope's focal length is. So very long focal length. And I believe a Hyperstar reduces it to around 300 millimeters. So it greatly reduces the focal length. So you're no longer going to be zoomed in way far. So this is going to be better for things like wide field nebula. But the other huge advantage is that it turns it into an f2 lens. So you're able to then collect data much, much faster. And you also have the advantage of having that huge 203 millimeter or 8-inch aperture of the telescope, which is wonderful for collecting light. It's essentially a light bucket at f2. Now, the downside is these devices like Hyperstars or even FastStar, which is essentially Celestron's answer to Hyperstar, because they saw that Hyperstar was selling so many of these, they decided we should probably make our own version, is that they're very expensive. So you are going to be looking to spend, I believe it's around $1,000 for a Hyperstar. Let me check real quick for an 8-inch Edge HD exactly how much you pay. So yeah, that's actually right on the money. $999 for a Hyperstar for the Edge HD 8. So that's going to reduce it down to f1.9. So just about at f2, but a little bit faster. It's going to give you that super wide field of view. And it really kind of does give you, two telescopes in one. I heard somebody else describe how it's 3 telescopes in one. I'm not really certain on how that is the case. I'm sure one of you guys could tell me. Feel free to email me if you'd like. That's ruastrocast@gmail.com. And the reason I'm bringing this all up is because I actually was talking with one of our listeners this week. His name is Craig, and he is up in Richmond, Virginia. He wrote me to let me know he's a fan of the show, and was asking if I had ever visited the Richmond Astronomical Society up in Richmond, Virginia, as they have regular events up there. And I did check it out online, and it looks pretty similar to, our own Charlotte Astronomy Club as far as, how the get-togethers work and what everybody does. I'm sure most clubs are pretty similar, but he had said that he wasn't particularly interested in a Hyperstar because it costs so much, and that, the reason that he got his Edge HD, or I'm sorry, his C8, I'm not sure if he said it was the Edge HD model or not, but the reason he has his Schmidt-Cassegrain is because he really appreciates the long focal length. And another thing that we do need to make sure we mention is you cannot use a filter wheel with a Hyperstar. So a filter wheel is really important when you're using something like a, Edge HD type scope or any large Schmidt Cassegrain. I keep stumbling on that word. I'm just going to say SCT going forward. And the reason is because most people with these types of setups are going to be imaging in monochrome, or we could say black and white, but really it's monochrome. And that is because they can individually filter out each wavelength of light as they go through the night and get data on hydrogen, on oxygen. They can get data on red, data on green, data on blue, data on luminance. And that's very important to have a filter wheel because you have to change filters very frequently when you image in monochrome, unless you're doing something like dual narrowband imaging. I suppose you could do that. Forgive me, I don't image a monochrome yet, but I would assume that you could do just 2 focal lengths, similar to how we do with one-shot color cameras. But I would think the majority of people that are imaging on something like a C8 would be using a filter wheel. Now, I believe with a Hyperstar, you can use a filter drawer, which is basically a device that lets you screw filters into a little drawer, and then you can basically change out each filter manually. But a lot of people don't like to do that because you can, bump the scope. It's not as convenient as a filter wheel, not even close. Filter wheels can be fully automated, set it and forget it. It'll automatically switch for you. And you can set it to automatically refocus. And it really does make it easy. And that is one of the things that you unfortunately cannot do once you have a Hyperstar attached, because it does change the way that the telescope is set up, essentially. You no longer have a lens coming out of the back that you can connect a Hyperstar to, but you have your camera mounted in the front. So yeah, take that for what it's worth. So I actually looked at the RASA 8-inch, which is another telescope that Celestron offers. And initially I was like, man, this is right up my alley because I love imaging at f2. After doing it for just a few weeks, I see what the huge benefit is, and I love it, just being able to gather data so quickly. But unfortunately, similar to the SCT, you cannot attach a filter wheel. You could use a filter drawer, but I am looking at options for my first home observatory, which is something that we are going to be discussing today. So if I'm going to be building an observatory, then I would want to be able to automate the process as much as possible, because ideally I would like to get it set up to where I could not even have to press a button and the observatory knows when it's nice out. You have a weather station, so it knows that it's clear out, that there's no rain. And then, when it sees that there's no rain and that it's past, astronomical dark, the drawer or roof rather automatically rolls off, and then the telescope gets into position for whatever target I have picked already and starts imaging. Now, I know for a fact that my friends Rick and Jeff at Dark Dragons Astronomy can do exactly that, because that is how they have their observatory set up down at the Club Observatory in South Carolina that I frequent. And I would like to build it this way because ultimately I really do want to build an observatory down at the club, but it's kind of not like super far away, but far enough away to where you need to plan very, very well, or you're going to be driving an hour to get to your closest, Home Depot or Lowe's to get parts. And I thought the small building that I'm going to need for the observatory here at home would be an excellent test run. So I'm essentially considering building a really small, 6x6 or 8x8 type shed in the front yard, right beside the driveway. I've got a perfect spot for it. and with a roll-off roof, and it wouldn't have a warm room. My garage where I do all of my work out of is less than 10 feet away from the spot where it would sit, and just be able to fully automate everything. And when I, started planning for this, I started thinking to myself, like we all do, of course, if I could get anything, if I could get, the perfect setup for this observatory, what would it be? And that's kind of how I first initially thought of the rasoscope. But after realizing that I couldn't use a filter wheel with it and a few other things, not the least of which is I already have a really awesome F2 rig right behind me with the Rokinon 135. Obviously, the aperture isn't as large as the RASA, and there are several other advantages. There's a reason the RASA is $2,000 and my lens is $500. But that being said, I still wanted to, start thinking about what I would ultimately like to put in the observatory. So I've been looking at various mounts and various telescopes, and I really would like to get something a little bit unique. I don't want to get just another William Optic scope. This is nothing against people who have William Optic scopes. They're beautiful devices, and they clearly do a very good job. But I'm kind of a nerd, and I want to find something unique, maybe a little quirky. I don't know. I started looking at Stellar View refractors, and I really, really like what they're doing. So I posted on the Learning Astronomy Facebook group, kind of posed the question, if you were building an observatory, what would you get? And, kind of said what I was looking for, what I was not looking for, etc. And after going back and forth a little bit, I got into a talk with a guy about Stellar View scopes, and I went on their website and started looking around, and I really, really like what they're doing. And it's a little bit more expensive, obviously, than some of the cheaper refractors. But when you start looking into reviews and for how they're made, you begin to understand why they are more expensive. So something that I don't think a lot of people consider when they're buying a new telescope, particularly if you're new to astronomy and astrophotography, is what type of glass that telescope has. And it's important to mention because this is ultimately, what's going to determine the quality of your stars, which is very important. The sharpness of your, lines in your nebulae, just the overall image quality is pretty much 99% determined by the glass. So you definitely want to have good glass if you can afford to get good glass. And the reason that I bring that up is because I initially was looking at the Astrocast scopes, and I started watching some reviews, and I came across a video of Trevor from Astro Backyard, and he was reviewing one of the very large Astrocast scopes. I see a trend of this happening with some of the lower cost telescope makers, where they're starting to make really, really large refractors. You're talking 120, 150. I've even seen 180. And I believe Astrocast has a 200 millimeter refractor planned, which is just massive. And I mean massive, like taller than you massive. And he was taking photos with it, and he genuinely seemed excited about it. He looked at the build quality. It was very nice. All the aluminum parts were beautifully anodized. The paint job looked great on it. Overall, the quality of the scope looked wonderful. But then when it came time to look at the actual images, he noticed some very odd fringing on the stars. And I didn't see if he updated the video or updated comments to see if he figured out if it was something in his imaging train. He said he wasn't really sure. I read a lot of the comments, and a lot of people, not to say that they're right, because a lot of people say wrong stuff in groups, and they're very wrong all the time. Check literally any Facebook page in the world to find this out. But I do know that Astrocast does not tell you what type of glass that they use. So take that for what it's worth. If you're not advertising the type of glass that you're using, there's probably a reason for it. Because if you are using very nice glass, that glass is very expensive. And very expensive glass costs a lot of money, right? So if the glass costs a whole lot of money, you are going to want to advertise that as a reason for potentially purchasing this telescope. And there are lots of different kinds of quality glasses out there. I believe FPL 55 is one of the more common nice glasses. I can't remember if it's made in Japan. I believe it is. You know what? Let me check that out real quick and I'll let you know. All right, so it does look like that is actually manufactured in Ohara, Japan, Hoya, Japan. Different companies in Japan manufacture these glasses. And I said FPL 55, but there's also FPL 51, 53, FCD 100, and lots of other types of glass as well. And this is something that you are definitely going to want to look into if you are like me, starting to look at what your next refractor is going to be. So obviously I'm talking about building this observatory and planning for it appropriately. When I started in astronomy, I didn't really have any friends who were into it, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I went out and I bought a Celestron Newtonian on an alt-az mount, thinking this will be great for astrophotography to get started. I was very, very wrong. There are great imaging Newtonians, to be clear, but this one isn't really one of them. I suppose you could finagle it into being an imaging Newtonian. I'm not going to get into that, but I wasn't going to do that. So I still use that scope today as a visual scope, and it's great for when, you know, we got friends over and they want to look through an eyepiece. But eventually I figured out, as most will, that I needed to get an equatorial mount and a refractor scope. And I started looking around for refractor scopes. And not unlike whenever I first got into photography, I was blown away at the cost of telescopes, refractors. And I decided to go with one of the cheaper ones to get started. Now, I ended up getting the SV Bony 80 ED, and I got the reducer for it as well. And I will say overall, it's been a very good scope. And I really think it's actually, honestly, if I'm telling the truth, I think it's been the perfect scope to learn astronomy on, because I got it at the time. I think I got it for about $400. They might be a little bit more expensive now since this whole astrophotography boom has happened. I think they may have upped their price a little bit. But looking at the most recent builds, it looks like they do use FPL 51 extra low dispersion glass, which is excellent. Now they do only use that on the very front objective element. And a lot of times you will see with nicer telescopes that they might use ED glass on the front and the rear element. And I suppose if you get into like a super nice Takahashi type telescope that is, you know, $7,000-8,000, you might see ED glass all the way through. But that being said, it does leave quality to be desired. And I feel that I have now reached the point with that telescope where I have maximized my skill level on it. And I want to pause on that point for a moment and just briefly talk about maximizing skill level with the equipment that you have. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I've gotten into this conversation so many times with people who maybe they are, you know, buying their very first telescope, or maybe they have a telescope and they're not happy with the results they're getting. So they want to go out and buy a whole new rig and spend a whole lot of money and think that that's going to somehow magically improve their astrophotography skills overnight. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who learned from knowing absolutely nothing to now selling his own prints for a pretty good profit, that you will not increase your astrophotography skill by buying expensive gear. You just won't. So I'm a firm believer in maximizing every last bit that you can out of your gear before upgrading it to something nicer. So don't feel ashamed or worried about buying something like an SV Bony 80 ED to get started on. Okay, yeah, maybe it is only $400 or $500, but you can spend all the money that you save on that to put towards a much nicer equatorial mount, which is something that you can continue using for years, even if you decide to upgrade your telescope later down the road. I bought a CEM 26 by Ioptron, which at the time, I believe it was about $1,400, if I'm not mistaken. And it's been an awesome equatorial mount. Now, it doesn't have a huge payload capacity, 26 pounds. I don't like to put more than 15 or 16 pounds on it. But the tracking on it's great. The auto guiding, phenomenal. It is whisper quiet whenever you're slewing. You can't even hear the thing operating, and it's just buttery smooth when you balance it. So, spend your money where you feel it's necessary. But my whole point here being, going out and buying absolute top of the line gear on day one, it's not going to do you any favors. If you've got the money and you can afford to do that, by all means, go for it. But this stuff isn't cheap at all. So I'm saving up now so I can ultimately get the refractor that's going to last me for 20 years. You know what I mean? So the SV Bony, while I fully expect that it's going to last me for years and years because it is very well made, it's not something that I ultimately want to continue my journey on now that I feel that I've gotten to that next level in astrophotography. So I will keep it. I will still use it. But when I build my permanent observatory, a much nicer refractor will live inside of it. And I feel like I've earned that because I've been, learning for 3 years how to do astrophotography from the ground up. So it's time to step up and get those perfect color stars that are, pinpoint sharp. That being said, not for nothing, but a lot of the software tools that we have available to us today can, particularly something like Blur Exterminator, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between really, really expensive glass and something like a SV Bony by the time you get done, processing everything in Pixinsight. So, take that for what you will. I do feel like ultimately you will get better results that are cleaner and more defined with nicer glass for obvious reasons. You get what you pay for, right? The old adage is as true today as it ever was. But keep all those things in mind. If you're thinking about buying a new telescope, that's definitely something to consider. Switching gears a little bit, guys, I wanted to mention something pretty cool that I purchased. I guess it's been a couple months ago now that I've had it. I got my new Android phone. I switched back from iPhone to Android. I've been a lifelong Android user. I was actually a beta tester with the very first Android phone in America, which was the G1 on T-Mobile. They were the first carrier to have it back in the day. And anyway, I say all that because I went to iPhone for the first time a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed it. I get why people love iPhone so much now. I guess the best thing that I could say about it is it just works. Everything just kind of works, especially if you get the whole ecosystem going. I had the watch, the AirPods, and the iPhone and my MacBook, and everything worked beautifully together. But I ended up going back to Samsung because the S24 Ultra, I guess it is, came out, and I really, really was digging the camera and the astrophotography mode, of course, on it. And whenever I got the camera, I realized that the chintzy little smartphone mount that I had wasn't really going to cut it for holding this $1,300 computer for 10 minutes at a time while it's taking shots of the Milky Way. So I wanted to find something that could hold the smartphone securely, which is obviously very important to me. And I ended up finding a really cool device called the Ulanzi ST03 smartphone mount. And this is it's a smartphone mount that is, similar to others, and that it clamps around the phone. So you put your phone in horizontally, and then you can loosen or tighten it, depending on how you want it to fit. But the upside is that it has real camera connections. So you have like a 1/4 inch mount on the bottom, so you can screw it directly into a ball head, which is awesome, or a tripod with a ball head, if you will. And it also has a cold shoe connection up top. So if you wanted to connect a microphone to it, for example, you could do that, or a flash, if you wanted to, you could do that. But the reason that I wanted it is because it was a really solidly made all metal construction phone mount to hold my phone while it takes these 10-minute long exposures in the Pro RAW mode of the Samsung Galaxy phone. So you can buy these for $15 on Amazon, which is a pretty awesome price. And I've had mine for a few months now. It's holding up wonderfully. And anytime that the Milky Way is out and you're in a dark sky, you will absolutely love having this. Now, I will say that you do need to have a tripod to go with it. So, a small tripod like a Gorilla Pod is a great purchase to have with this, something that you can adjust the legs on, because something you want to keep in mind, obviously, when you're doing astrophotography, a lot of times you need to aim that camera lens darn near directly up, particularly if the Milky Way is up near not the meridian, the zenith. And the zenith is the very highest part of the sky. So if you look directly overhead at any given point in the night, that is your zenith. So if you wanted to shoot the Milky Way and it was at the zenith, obviously you would have to tilt this smartphone holder backwards pretty far. And if you have something like a Joby Gorilla Pod with, flexible legs that you can put, way down, narrow to the ground, then you can do that without having to worry about your phone falling over. So if you need to get a tripod, Joby Gorilla Pod is what I would recommend. And then obviously a ball head goes great with this as well. So I just thought I would mention that because we are coming into Milky Way season finally. I checked in Stellarium and it is indeed rising in the Northern Hemisphere just shortly after midnight right now. And, within a month, it'll be, 11 o'clock at night that it's rising, which is awesome. That's when my dark sky trip is happening. We're going the exact same time that we did last year. And it's so perfect because by the time it actually gets dark, that's when you can start seeing the Milky Way rise out there. And you just literally get to watch it go all the way overhead throughout the night. And I am extremely excited to do that. And I guess I need to also test out a few other things on filters. I was thinking about it. Obviously, I mentioned that F2 L Extreme filter a few times on the show, but it's funny. I was messing with the wide field rig and trying to figure out how to get my filter drawer and this blue Fireball manual rotator that I purchased together within the 38 millimeters of backspace that I have available to me before I get to my ASI 294 MC Pro camera. And I was having a very hard time doing it. I'll just tell you, I couldn't get it to work because it seems like no matter what adapter I buy, I'm coming up just a little bit too long. I've already done the infinity mod on the lens that Nico provides from Nebula Photos. That's an awesome mod, one that everybody will need to do if they get the Rokinon lens. But anyway, I was kind of freaking out because one of the targets that I'm going for is Rho Ophiuchi. And it's a beautiful nebula region, and the Rokinon 135 is just perfectly situated for capturing it as far as focal length. You can get the whole thing and then some of the dark nebulosity that leads back into the Milky Way. And the problem that I was having is whenever I screwed my camera all the way in with the filter drawer installed and then the little spacer that I had to get to 38, Rho was not framed up correctly. And when you have this particular rig, you use something called the Astrodynium ring system. I know that sounds way fancier than it is, but it's essentially a 3D printed ring system that the lens sits inside of. And it has an attachment for it that allows you to attach an autofocuser, which is really, really, really nice to have for this lens. And I got into a discussion with somebody on a board that said, you know, I don't understand why people even need an autofocuser with this lens because it's so wide, yada, yada, yada. But I can tell you, I had this lens for a year without the autofocuser, and at f2, having an autofocuser is so nice because that focal plane for focus is just so narrow. You might think that you're sharply focused, and you can use a Batinov mask, of course. But having an autofocuser makes it so much easier, and dealing with temperature changes throughout the night. Obviously, you need to refocus, and having an autofocuser to me was just a must have. So the problem that it presented was that I wasn't able to rotate the lens anymore, because essentially once you get those rings attached and you have the autofocuser attached, the lens is almost locked into place because you have this plastic ring that goes around the actual focus wheel of the lens. And then you have a belt that goes around that obviously rotates whenever you're focusing the lens. And there's no way to easily rotate the lens. And whenever I was doing test shots of RAW from my house, I noticed that it was not even close to framed up correctly. It was basically up and down when I needed it to be side to side. And I'm just putting that very simply. So I needed to be able to be certain that I could rotate my camera properly before going on this dark sky trip. And I was trying everything in my power to get this camera rotator to work correctly. I actually bought it once, sent it back, and then ordered it again from Agena Astro. They probably think I'm nuts. I hope they sent me back the same one that I bought the first time. Sorry to you guys for having to send that out twice. But anyway, I still haven't succeeded. And I finally broke down a couple days ago and said, all right, I need to be able to rotate this lens in the field manually in a pinch if I can't get this to work, because my only other option really was unscrewing the camera essentially, and not just the camera, but like everything that attaches to the flange of the lens. And I did not want to do that because I don't want a loose camera hanging off the back of my rig. It could turn more, you know, it could screw up a whole night shots. That is not ideal. So I ended up actually getting out my Allen wrenches, and I found a couple of grub screws that I could loosen up. So I loosened the two rings first. So those are just thumb screws that you can loosen up. And then there is a grub screw on the actual plastic part that I was referring to that goes around the lens. And once I loosened that up and took that screw out, I was able to actually physically rotate the lens. I will have to refocus it, obviously, but that's okay. I don't mind refocusing it as long as I can physically rotate the entire lens, which is what I was able to do. So in a pinch, I will be able to adjust the framing of the camera now. All that being said, if any of you guys are listeners and you have a similar setup, the Rokinon 135 with the Astrodynium rings with the electronic autofocuser, it's an extremely popular setup. A lot of astrophotographers have something similar, and you do have a camera rotator installed on it properly, please feel free to drop me an email with some photos and details explaining how you were able to get that thing connected properly. Astrocast@gmail.com if you'd like to reach out, because like I said, as much as I tried, and believe me, I tried a lot, I just couldn't get that thing to work. But you know, it's funny though. I was so worried about making sure that the filter drawer worked. And then I realized, wait a minute, I'm going to Bortle 1 skies. I don't even need to use a filter. But then I got thinking more about it, and I was like, actually, I'm still going to want to use a UV IR cut filter, which is something that if you're not using any other type of filter, most of your astrophotography cameras they don't have an infrared or UV cut filter by default. They leave those off on purpose. And that is something that generally speaking, you would want to have if you're not using any other filter to make sure that you get nice sharp stars. So I do want to have that filter drawer accessible. So I ended up ordering which company is it that I got from? It was Optolong again. I got the Optolong UV IR cut filter in the 2-inch mounted variety. So that will go very well with my 2-inch F2L Extreme filter, and I wanted to get some extra filter drawers, so I could put different filters in different drawers and then just swap them out. But they were sold out everywhere, so I couldn't actually find any. I'm going to have to look around again. I saw one that was available, but it was specifying that it was for the Nikon variety of the filter drawer, and I don't think they're universal. I might shoot an email over to a couple of the astronomy companies and see what they say. I don't want to buy something and then it turns out it doesn't fit, obviously, and then have to turn around and send it back. But it wasn't really super clear on the descriptions whether or not it would. I'm also really curious if any of you guys have any cool trips planned for the summertime. If anyone's going to be making any dark skies trips. My brother, the one that I mentioned a couple episodes ago, who offered to take me out to the West Coast dark skies, has actually made good on that bet. And he wasn't just drinking that night and throwing out crazy stuff, but he really is offering to take me. So I'm going to be taking him up on that. And I believe it's called Little Redfish Lake. And it's at a crazy altitude. Here, I'll bring it up. Yeah, so it's in Idaho at about 6,500 feet. And Bortle 1 skies. So there's a lot of Bortle 1 skies in that area. You do have to hike in to get to the darkest areas, of course, as I would imagine. But it looks incredible out there. I just have to find time when I can do it because I already have a week off for the dark sky trip I'm taking in June. And then me and my wife are taking a week off in September for our 10-year anniversary, which I'm extremely excited about. And we are going to be traveling down to Savannah, Georgia to take in all the sights there, as we've never been to Savannah. So it might end up having to wait until next summer. I hope it doesn't. But if it does, I'm hoping Idaho and this planet will still be there. As long as it is, we will certainly be making that trip. So cool things that came out of NEAF this year. The Northeastern Astronomical Forum, which is, again, is a gathering of all the big astronomy companies, generally show up there, and lots of the YouTuber astronomer personalities show up as well. A lot of cool stuff came out of it, but one thing in particular caught my eye: the new Skywatcher wave mounts. So this is their strain wave mount that they're coming out with. It seems like every company is coming out with their own strain wave mounts now. But I really, really like the look of these strain wave mounts, particularly the bigger one, the 150i. That looks like it's going to be a bargain. So it's coming in at $21.95. So a couple $100 more than what you pay for something like an AM5. However, whenever it's in EQ mode with the counterweights, it actually has a 55-pound weight capacity. So it can carry, a pretty significant more amount of weight than what you can with the AM5. And it still only weighs 12.8 pounds, which I believe is a little bit heavier than the AM5, to be fair. So you trade off a little bit of that portability, but you do get a much higher payload. Without the counterweights, 33 pounds. So for pretty much any refractor of reasonable size, you're going to be able to use it without counterweights, which is really awesome. I saw that they have an attachment for it too, where you can actually mount 2 telescopes to it, which I think is really awesome to have that kind of built in directly to the mount as an accessory. Because I know a lot of people like to do that with like a RASA, for example, get, 2 F2 scopes going and then maybe, put a filter on each one of them for a different wavelength of light. And then just, image at F2 all night long with 2 of the same scopes, which would be really fun to have if you had the kind of money to do that. I know I would certainly love to do something like that, but it looks like it's going to be a really, really good deal. It's got some really cool features. It looks like it's up for pre-order right now. I don't know when it's going to be releasing. They also have a smaller model available, the Wave 100i, and that one's going for about $1,700. Counterweight kit, $110. That's not too bad for a counterweight kit, honestly. It comes with the counterweight bar, an extension bar, and then it looks like 3 counterweights. So that should be awesome. And overall, it looks pretty great. Speaking of mounts, I was looking at mounts when I was daydreaming about building my observatory. And it got me thinking about encoders. So I don't know if you've ever heard of encoders when it comes to equatorial mounts, but they essentially are devices that get added on to an equatorial mount that allow it to be able to track at a much, much, much finer degree than what a regular equatorial mount can track at. To the point where a lot of times you don't even need auto guiding anymore. I guess you would need auto guiding to get started, but after that, you technically wouldn't need it, because if you have a good encoder, it tracks so perfectly that you really don't have to have auto guiding is my understanding of it. I've never owned one of these because they are very expensive. I was looking at a couple of the options that are available in the, consumer market, if you will. And I think generally, at least a couple $1,000 to $3,000 more than what you would pay for the same mount without encoders. I couldn't justify that price. I don't think. I would just use an auto guider and be happy. But if you were somebody who was imaging at a really long focal length, we're talking more than 2000 millimeters, then encoders might be something that you would definitely want to look into. So if you've never heard of them, they're really interesting. And I actually found an awesome video on them. It was from Dylan O'Donnell on YouTube, who has a really awesome channel called Star Stuff. And it's actually an older video. He reviews the EQ8RH Pro, which is one with built-in encoders, and he actually goes over quite thoroughly and gives examples of where encoders are used elsewhere in society, including a really cool example he gives with a guitar that has encoders built in for tuning it. And it just goes over the precision that it's involved with having encoders. So super, super cool mounts. Again, not something that I think is in my future unless I get $1 million scratch off lottery ticket. But if you got the money and you want to get the best of the best, an encoded mount is definitely something worth considering. And just how accurate are we talking? Well, your average equatorial mount generally will track at about 3.5 arc seconds RMS, and then you add auto guiding, and obviously it gets significantly better from there. But your encoder type mounts generally are less than 0.3 arc seconds RMS, and that is before adding auto guiding. Arc seconds is a useful way of measuring the night sky. It's kind of our smallest length that we see in astronomy. And it's a easy way to keep up with how well your auto guiding is going throughout the night by looking at the RMS numbers. And, most of us are happy to be between 0.5 and 1.0 RMS. And again, less than 0.3 with an encoder. And I just looked at the CEM70EC to grab that number. And then the regular CEM, like 26, for example, like what I have, is 3.5 arc seconds RMS. Now, again, adding auto guiding obviously increases that significantly. And I generally get, with good seeing, I can get around 0.6 with it. Sometimes better, but generally speaking, I'm around 1.0 RMS with that particular mount, and this gets you significantly more accurate than that. So if you did want to have the best of the best in terms of tracking for very long focal length telescope, if you were looking at really small galaxies, then you would definitely want to look at something with encoders. And then one other thing I wanted to mention to you guys, just a little tip that I've known about for a long time, and it just never occurred to me, why shouldn't I mention this on the show? If you're an ASI Air user and you use auto guiding, which I would imagine most ASI Air users do, there is a very easy way that you can often improve your auto guiding, and that is by simply building a dark library for your auto guiding. So obviously we know darks help you calibrate and make your images look better during processing, because it's going to basically tell the software exactly what a dark field looks like, and it'll let you know where any dead or stuck or hot pixels are on your camera sensor. And the same can be said when doing auto guiding, particularly if you're at like a longer focal length. It is not uncommon for an auto guider to think that a hot pixel is actually a star. And if you build a dark library, you can negate that, so you don't have to deal with those type of problems. And it's super easy to do within the ASI Air. All you need to do is actually click on the little guiding icon up top, and then scroll down to guide settings. And then there is an option to build a dark library. Just put your cap on your guide scope or whatever you have, put your guide scope in a really dark drawer and shut it, and then let it do its thing, and it will build that dark library for you. And that should last you, easily 3 months. Just update it however you feel necessary. And then you can also do something similar when you're doing live stacking through EAA. The ASI Air actually offers you the option to import a master dark, flats, and then bias frames as well. I would think at a minimum, if you're doing EAA and you're wanting to, show other people as you're looking, if you're in a situation where, I don't know, you've got friends and family over, maybe you want to mirror your phone screen to a projector if you have it set up outside. Just a kind of a cool idea for the summertime that's rolling around. Say that you've got a cheap projector and you got one of those screens that you can project on your garage, or heck, just project it on the side of your house. You could go in and actually load in a master dark, so that way you will get a better quality image. And if you take your flats before your session begins, you can often take flats at the end of a session. That's what most people do, but you can take them at the beginning of a session just as well. Then you could load those flats in as well. And these are things that you can do to improve the overall image quality while you're doing electronically assisted astronomy within the ASI Air. So I think a lot of us get stuck on using our little phone, and we forget how flexible our phones are, particularly with things like screen mirroring and Chromecasting. We can send that phone screen to a bigger screen if we want other people to be able to watch. And since we got Milky Way season rolling around and all the beautiful nebula are going to be up in the Northern Hemisphere, just wanted to throw out a couple of ideas that you could use. The same could be said inside the house. So if you wanted to set up your telescope outside and then, build a dark library, load in your flats, bias frames if you'd like, and then go inside, turn on the living room TV, and then Chromecast your screen from your phone directly to the TV. Or you could use your tablet if you're using that, so that way you can still use your phone without having to interrupt the show. Then that way everybody could watch as the nebula loads. And when you do EAA in the ASI Air, it does give you the option to save all of the frames individually. So this is a cool way that you can kind of have some fun with others, let them watch as these images come down, but then you still have all the images the next day when you want to go through and process them into one really beautiful finalized image. Got a few more things to mention here before we get wrapped up for this week. I want to send a giant thank you to our newest Patreon member. That is David Hess. Thank you so much, David. I got your message. I sent you a little video clip, and I know me and you briefly talked back and forth. It's awesome that you're getting back into astronomy. He actually got to shoot some of the really cool comets back in the day with a film camera on his buddy C8 telescope. So we conversed a little bit about that on the Patreon. If you ever want to talk back and forth, feel free to join. We got 2 different levels. We have the Happy Dude level at just $1 per month. And then you can also join in at the higher level of the Astrocast Society for $5 a month if you would like to support the show. And again, all that money is just right now going towards paying for the podcast itself as far as the hosting of the podcast. I'm also working on building out a webpage so I can actually own the domain for the Astrocast. That's something that I've been working on this week. And Patreon is going to help me pay for those sort of things. So initially, we said strictly for advertising. And I told you guys if that ever changed, I would let you know exactly where that money would be going. So I'm letting you know. I am building a website for the Astrocast, and also some of that money is going to go to the current cost that I have associated with hosting the podcast, because obviously I got to pay a monthly fee every month to post this podcast because nobody does it for free. they don't do it well for free anyway. So anyway, enough. I'm not going to sit here and digitally panhandle, but giant thank you so much, David, for joining. And a big shout out to Carrie Hazelton, our other Patreon member. If you want to join, again, that is patreon.com/the Astrocast. We're starting to get more members now. And I think when we get at least 5 Patreon members, we'll probably do the first meetup like I talked about on Discord, get everybody together and talk for one night, maybe set up one night when it's clear. I don't know. We'll have to look at everybody's time zones and everything and see if that actually works. But if it does, I would love to do that. Now, my recommendation for this week, it's going to be a little bit different in that this is not strictly astronomy related. But it is very much related to the current world that we're all living in. And I got to tell you guys, if you want to read a book that is going to leave you shook, this is probably a good one to pick up right now. It's actually called Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen. And this book, I want to preface it by saying it takes out all politics. It does not discuss any sort of political scenario that would lead up to a nuclear war. It strictly discusses a hypothetical nuclear war and how it could unfold and how close we could be to it unfolding any hour of any day now. And that is according to people with very high ranking positions in our government that have been in charge of our nuclear weapons for decades. So if you want to check that out, Annie Jacobsen is the author. It's an excellent Audible listen. She actually narrates the book herself, and she does a very good job. She's an excellent narrator. I actually picked it up on Audible. You guys know I'm a big Audible fan if you listen to the show regularly, but it's a good read as well. So highly recommend checking that out. I've always been fascinated by nuclear war and the history of the nuclear bomb. I do find it incredibly terrifying how many nuclear weapons are on this planet and active and pointed at human beings at any given time. And they're ready to go off at quite literally a hair trigger's notice. It's scary stuff, but I think it's important stuff for people to know, because I feel like a lot of people are very ignorant as to what is actually happening with our nuclear weapons. And they just assume that the government is taking care of it and everything's okay. And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. And that is not a political stance. That's not a left or right stance. That is a government for the last 70 years has not really been keeping your best interest in mind when it comes to nuclear war. So highly recommend that you give that book a read or a listen. And also, just real quick, I wanted to mention, obviously, I said I was working on the website. When I buy the domain, which will be coming up hopefully in the very near future, I'll likely get a new email address, but I'll make sure that I update everyone on what that new email address is when that happens. But in the interim, if you have any questions, if you would like to ask me a question to have read on the show, or if you just have a question for me or want to say hi, please shoot me an email, ruastrocast@gmail.com. I absolutely love hearing from you guys. Nothing makes my day more than hearing from a listener that says, you know, they enjoy hearing the show, or they just have a question for me, or even a correction. We actually got a really good correction just a couple days ago on the YouTube channel from, and forgive me if I botch your name, man, I'm sorry if I do, Demeril Nakati. He actually pointed out on episode 8, Let's Shoot the Milky Way, when I was talking about Rokinon having basically a sister brand that is the same brand depending on what country you're in. I actually said Rokinon and Sigma, and it's Rokinon and Samyang. So I kind of botched that one. So really good catch on that one, man. Thank you for pointing that out. And if you guys ever hear anything like that, please feel free to send me a correction, because I am going to start doing a corrections part at the end of each show. I know that I mess things up from time to time. I speak 95% of this podcast right off the top of my head. I take a few little notes as they come to me throughout the week for things that I want to talk about on the show. But I try to keep it as unscripted as possible, because I just think it comes out more naturally that way, and kind of like you're sitting down and just chatting with a friend. So thank you for pointing that out again, Demeril. And As I pointed out to you guys, we are available on YouTube now. We weren't before, but if you want to go search for the Astrocast on YouTube, I have it set up now where the RSS feed essentially uploads every new episode directly to YouTube. So that's pretty cool. Starting to get some viewers there and some new subscribers, which is great. Still have Spotify and Apple Podcast by far as our number one listener home. So I think that's going to do it for this week, guys. I hope you don't mind. We kind of returned back to just a sit down and chat about astronomy for an hour kind of feel this week. I know we got really deep into the weeds over the last couple of weeks with the Pixinsight series. If you liked it, let me know. If you didn't care for it, let me know. I love feedback. It seems like the first episode got a lot of listens and the second one, not as much as what I see on a regular weekly basis. It's just something that I like to, kind of play around with different formats and figure out what works best. It occurs to me that obviously anyone can go on YouTube and find visual aids to go with their tutorials. So perhaps a podcast isn't the best place to do that, but it is still something that I wanted to try and information that I wanted to put out there for any of you guys that prefer to take in your information in podcast form. So I hope it was helpful to at least one or two people. And like I say, if you have any suggestions for show topics or feedback, please feel free to shoot me an email. Again, that email is ruastrocast@gmail.com. So that is going to do it for this week's episode of the Astrocast. Again, I'm your host, Ru. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and clear skies.